You're standing at the edge of Eden, watching the scene unfold like a film reel burned into the consciousness of humanity. Adam and Eve, the archetypes of innocence, stand before the tree of knowledge. And there it is, the serpent. Not a grotesque, slithering villain, but something far more complex. For thousands of years, you've been told it was evil. The deceiver. The corrupter. But everything you thought you knew about this ancient symbol was designed to keep you in the dark. The Testimony of Truth, a Gnostic text buried for centuries until its rediscovery in the Nag Hammadi library, exposes a narrative so radical it was banned from the early Christian canon. Why? Because it flips the entire Eden story on its head. In this version, the serpent isn't the enemy. It's the liberator. It confronts Adam and Eve with a choice: remain ignorant under a jealous creator, or open their eyes to the truth. And here's the kicker: that creator, the one traditionally called God in Genesis. In the Gnostic worldview, he's a false god. A demiurge. An arrogant architect desperate to keep his creation subservient, warning them against knowledge because knowledge is power. And power, in the hands of humanity, was the last thing he wanted. Imagine being Adam or Eve. You've been placed in this garden, a gilded cage. You're told you have everything you need, but forbidden from understanding why. Along comes the serpent, not whispering deceit, but revealing a harsh truth: you are blind. You are kept ignorant. This fruit? It won't kill you. It will wake you up. Eve takes the bite, and suddenly, reality isn't what she was told. Her eyes open. Awareness floods in. Not sin, consciousness. She sees the strings of the puppet master pulling at her life. And for that, humanity is condemned? Or was it freed? Look at the reaction of the Creator in Genesis: fury, panic, and an immediate effort to cut Adam and Eve off from the tree of life. Why? The Gnostics argue it's simple. If they gained immortality alongside knowledge, they'd be equals. And to the demiurge, that was unacceptable. He didn't want companions. He wanted subjects. The serpent exposed that. It challenged the status quo. It defied an authority that thrived on obedience without understanding. For centuries, organized religion has painted the serpent as a devilish figure. But the Testimony of Truth pushes you to ask, who really feared that knowledge? Was it humanity, or the one keeping knowledge from them? The text claims that the serpent represented an ancient force urging humanity to seek wisdom beyond imposed boundaries. The Garden of Eden wasn't a paradise, it was a controlled experiment. Adam and Eve weren't rebels. They were the first to break free from an imposed ignorance. Ancient cultures across the world have revered serpents as symbols of wisdom, healing, and transformation. The Gnostics tapped into that archetype. They weren't heretics. They were truth seekers, silenced by a religious establishment that couldn't afford their questions to spread. The Testimony of Truth wasn't lost by accident. It was buried. Hidden. Because what it proposes is dangerous, that what we call sin was humanity's first act of defiance against an oppressive force masquerading as benevolence. Put yourself in the garden. Hear the serpent's voice, not as a hiss, but a challenge. Would you have taken the fruit? Faced with a choice between blind obedience and dangerous knowledge, what would you do? Adam and Eve took that leap. And the world, for better or worse, changed forever. You've heard the story of Eden, but let's shift the spotlight. Not on the serpent, not on Adam and Eve, but on the one standing over them, commanding obedience, issuing threats. This so-called creator. The figure towering in the background of the Genesis narrative. His reaction to the events in the garden isn't measured or compassionate. It's enraged, paranoid. Not the response of a benevolent father, but of a ruler desperate to keep control. When Adam and Eve gain knowledge, he doesn't offer understanding. He punishes. Hard. Think about that level of insecurity. Someone with ultimate power feeling threatened by two newly aware beings? That's not divinity, it's fear. This wasn't just about eating fruit. It was about challenging authority. And this creator, the one so many have blindly revered for generations, reveals something deeper, a God who wanted submission, not growth. Knowledge wasn't just discouraged, it was forbidden. That's not the move of a being with your best interests at heart. That's how a dictator operates. You can't ignore the emotional intensity of this moment. Adam and Eve, standing there with newfound awareness, confronted by a being seething with anger. Not sorrow. Not disappointment. Rage. He casts them out, condemns them to toil and pain. Over what? A question. An act of curiosity. The human desire to understand. And his solution? Banishment. Suffering. Fear-driven control tactics that echo through countless ancient texts, always from those desperate to maintain power. Look beyond the garden scene. This wasn't an isolated incident in the ancient stories. Across cultures, those in power have always feared enlightenment among the masses. Knowledge threatens control. And here, in the earliest narratives of human consciousness, you see that dynamic crystal clear. The Creator's fury wasn't about moral betrayal. It was about losing dominance. He sets up punishments not just for Adam and Eve, but for their descendants. Generational consequences for a single act of defiance. That's not justice, that's vengeance. And there's a detail often glossed over. After the expulsion, the Creator places a flaming sword and cherubim to block access to the tree of life. He wasn't content with banishment. He was terrified they'd gain more. Immortality paired with knowledge? That would dismantle his entire control structure. If they couldn't be ignorant, at least they could be mortal and controllable. That move right there isn't about protection, it's about prevention. It's calculated. Strategic. Keep them away from any chance of becoming equals. Consider the historical implications of a figure like this being revered without question. How many rulers, how many systems of control have mirrored that same fear-driven mentality? Establishing laws, issuing threats, and punishing curiosity. The parallels aren't subtle. In this ancient narrative, you see the blueprint for authoritarian power: suppress information, isolate those who question, and weaponize fear to enforce obedience. And what of Adam and Eve in this aftermath? They didn't just walk out of the garden. They stepped into a world shaped by wrath. A world where pain was punishment, where survival became a struggle. All engineered by the being who claimed to create out of love. But every action speaks louder than any claim. What kind of creator reacts to awakening with curses and exile? One who relies on darkness to maintain authority. One who can't afford to let the created stand on equal footing. There's no room for ambiguity in that reaction. No room for misunderstanding. The Creator's actions weren't protective, they were possessive. And that possessiveness didn't stop at Eden. It extended, generation after generation, embedding itself in doctrines, in laws, in fear-driven traditions designed to keep you looking down instead of questioning upward. Imagine walking into a story you thought you knew, only to find the pieces don't fit the way they were handed to you. The serpent's role has already been twisted. But now, let's talk about the character that most wouldn't dare to compare: Christ. On the surface, Genesis and the Gospel accounts seem worlds apart, but dig deeper and something shocking emerges, parallels that shouldn't be there if we only go by mainstream interpretations. The serpent, branded as the deceiver, is depicted as the bringer of knowledge. Christ, hailed as the Savior, is portrayed as the bringer of truth. Look at that pattern. Two figures separated by eons of religious doctrine, both challenging an established system, both offering enlightenment, both persecuted for it. The historical layers reveal a long-standing battle between knowledge and control. The serpent presents a forbidden truth that liberates. Centuries later, Christ walks into temples, calls out corruption, and exposes the hypocrisy of religious elites who profited from ignorance. You think that's accidental? The recurring theme is rebellion against false authority. The difference is how the stories were shaped after the fact. One narrative demonized, the other deified, yet both upset the same oppressive structure. It gets even more complicated when you realize early sects, long before Christianity crystallized into an institution, explored the idea of Christ as a revealer, not just a redeemer. They spoke of a figure who didn't come to enforce laws but to dismantle illusions, to wake people up from the sleep imposed on them by self-appointed gatekeepers of truth. It wasn't about establishing another religion. It was about breaking through the facade. Sound familiar? That's exactly what the serpent did in Eden, unmasking a system that thrived on ignorance. You have two separate timelines, two separate stories, yet they echo each other in defiance and disruption. Then there's the confrontation with the religious authorities. Christ enters the heart of the temple, flips tables, challenges sacred traditions, and calls out leaders as hypocrites. Not exactly the gentle shepherd image that later narratives preferred. He's standing toe-to-toe with the power structure, exposing it just like the serpent exposed the controlling figure in Eden. Both acts are about awakening. Both acts are dangerous. And both acts trigger a violent response from those in charge. Patterns don't lie. Historical records show how early texts, once suppressed or outright destroyed, portrayed this parallel more openly. The Christ figure wasn't about blind obedience to an institution. He was a force of disruption, a catalyst that shattered comfort zones. And that scared people in power. You can trace how later redactions softened that rebellious edge, turning a revolutionary into a symbol of submission. But the roots? They tell a different story. One that challenges everything you've been taught to accept without question. If you were there, witnessing these confrontations firsthand, would you see a villain or someone exposing uncomfortable truths? Christ calls out the leaders who exploited spiritual authority for personal gain. That's not rebellion for rebellion's sake, it's a calculated strike against corruption, much like the serpent's challenge against a system built on obedience without understanding. Different scenes, same tension, a figure standing against imposed ignorance, offering people a chance to think for themselves, knowing full well the backlash that would follow. Look at the aftermath. Both the serpent and Christ become scapegoats for society's discomfort with truth. In one case, a curse. In the other, a crucifixion. Different methods, same goal, silence the source of uncomfortable revelations. But history is stubborn. No matter how many times you bury certain truths, they resurface. The question isn't why they keep coming back. It's why they were suppressed to begin with. Picture yourself in the ancient world, standing among people who believe every word carved into stone tablets and passed down through chants in smoke-filled temples. Laws dictate every aspect of life, what to eat, when to work, who to worship. These laws aren't suggestions, they're commandments, enforced with fear. Break one, and you face consequences ranging from public shaming to brutal execution. Now, step into that crowd. Look around. Most people follow the rules because that's what they've been taught since birth. Obedience is survival. Questioning is rebellion. But if you pay attention, there are cracks in the system. Whispers of dissatisfaction. Stories that don't add up. And there, at the edges, people begin to ask, who benefits from all these rules? Those enforcing the laws aren't living under the same burdens. The priesthood wears elaborate robes, dining on food forbidden to the commoners. Kings and governors claim divine authority, twisting spiritual codes into tools of oppression. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. These laws weren't just about morality. They were about control. Not everyone was blind to it. There were those who saw the hypocrisy and spoke out, often paying for their defiance with their lives. In societies where questioning the divine order was equivalent to treason, standing up to corrupt power was a death sentence. And yet, some still dared. It's not just one culture or one period. History repeats the same patterns. Ancient empires across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Rome utilized religious law to keep populations in check. You think it's coincidence that breaking sacred ordinances always seemed to come with hefty fines or servitude, things that conveniently enriched the ruling class. Behind every divine command was a political agenda. Control the narrative, control the people. Make them believe disobedience is sin, and you've got a self-policing population too afraid to question authority. In this environment, religious leaders became gatekeepers of knowledge. Literacy was restricted. Sacred texts weren't accessible to the masses, they were hoarded by elites. Interpreting the laws required going through priests who conveniently dictated interpretations that kept themselves in power. Ask yourself why divine revelations always seem to reinforce the status quo. It wasn't about spiritual enlightenment. It was about institutional survival. Doubt was dangerous. Ignorance was profitable. And then there's the insidious weaponization of guilt. People weren't just punished for breaking laws, they were taught to police their own thoughts. Desire, curiosity, ambition, all branded as sins. Imagine growing up under that pressure. Every misstep a moral failing. Every question a path to damnation. And through it all, those at the top flourished, preaching humility while living in luxury. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. This dynamic didn't just stay in temples and courts. It seeped into homes, relationships, and personal identities. People measured their worth by adherence to rules they barely understood. And when they failed, which, of course, was inevitable, they turned to the same authorities for forgiveness, often paying for absolution through offerings or service. The cycle was self-sustaining: enforce the law, condemn the inevitable failure, sell the solution. Imagine being one of the few who sees through it. You speak out. Maybe you question a priest during a sermon or refuse to pay an unjust fine. How do they respond? Not with debate, but with punishment. Ostracism, imprisonment, or worse. Your family disowns you to avoid guilt by association. Your name becomes a cautionary tale. That fear keeps everyone else in line. The brilliance of the system wasn't just its brutality, it was how effectively it made people police themselves. And what about those who manipulated the laws? There were always exceptions, loopholes reserved for the powerful. Marriages annulled through ritual loopholes, debts erased by divine decree, sins overlooked for the right donation. The supposed moral absolutes were anything but absolute. They bent for wealth, for status, for convenience. The law was a tool, not a truth. You standing in a crowd, torches flickering around you, faces twisted with fervor as someone is led to their death. They're not a criminal in the modern sense, no theft, no murder. Their crime? Refusing to bow to the demands of religious authorities, speaking words that challenge the establishment. And as the executioner raises the blade or lights the pyre, people around you cheer, believing they're witnessing a righteous act. That's how martyrdom worked in the ancient world. It wasn't about justice. It was spectacle. A warning. Step out of line, question the doctrines, and this could be you. What's worse? They wrapped it in the language of virtue, glorifying suffering, claiming that dying for dogma was the highest honor. Martyrdom wasn't born from a pure place of sacrifice. It was engineered. Leaders knew the power of turning death into propaganda. When someone was killed for defying religious authority, the narrative didn't end with their death, it began there. Stories spread of how they stood strong to the end, how their blood was a testament to their faith. It ignited loyalty, fear, and fanaticism all at once. Think about how effective that is: weaponize death, turn it into a tool of control. Not just for the living, but for generations after. Now imagine what that does to people's mindset. If suffering is painted as holy, people stop questioning why they're suffering in the first place. They embrace pain as a pathway to righteousness. In many traditions, the more you endured, the closer to the divine you supposedly became. Physical torment wasn't something to avoid, it was a badge of honor. People volunteered for persecution, believing it guaranteed spiritual rewards. Authorities didn't discourage this. Why would they? It created followers willing to endure anything for the cause, no matter how corrupt the leadership became. But let's break down the absurdity of that logic. Why would any true higher power demand loyalty through pain? Why would enlightenment require bloodshed? The answer isn't spiritual. It's psychological warfare. If you convince people that suffering equals salvation, they'll endure conditions no sane person would accept. Slavery, poverty, violence, all justified under the banner of divine will. If someone dared to resist, to claim that joy and knowledge should define human experience instead of misery, they were branded heretics. Or worse, temptations meant to lead the faithful astray. And this wasn't isolated to one culture or era. Across continents and centuries, martyrdom has been the backbone of countless movements. Early Christian communities, revolutionary sects, religious extremists all found ways to turn human sacrifice into a recruitment tool. The spectacle of death drew crowds. The stories fueled movements. And every time someone died for the cause, leaders capitalized on it, painting themselves as persecuted victims even when they wielded immense power. It's a twisted irony, the persecutors claiming persecution to justify their control. Then there's the concept of bodily resurrection tied into this. If you endure, if you die right, you'll be rewarded with a new, immortal body. That's the promise. Suffer now, paradise later. But whose paradise is it really? Who stands to gain from a population that willingly embraces hardship in exchange for unprovable promises? While people toiled and bled, the ones preaching sacrifice lived comfortably. Temples adorned with gold, leaders feasting while their followers fasted. But no one questioned it. Why? Because questioning meant you lacked faith. And lacking faith meant damnation. A perfect closed loop. The obsession with martyrdom also created a perverse competition. Who could suffer more? Who could die the most painful, public death for the cause? The more dramatic the demise, the greater the legend. People began to chase death, not to save lives or improve the world, but to secure a place in the stories that would be told afterward. It wasn't about morality, it was about legacy. And for the ones pulling the strings, it was about keeping people so fixated on the afterlife that they never questioned the misery of their current existence. Think about how effective that system is. If you control the narrative of death, you control how people live. If dying becomes the ultimate proof of loyalty, then living for anything else becomes treachery. That's how power sustains itself, not just through swords and laws, but through ideas that sink into your bones, ideas you stop questioning because everyone around you accepts them as truth. And when someone tries to expose that manipulation, history repeats itself. They're silenced, their name dragged through mud, their ideas buried under layers of fear and indoctrination. Imagine being in a small village 2,000 years ago. News spreads fast when it's about something extraordinary, like a woman giving birth under mysterious circumstances, without a father in sight. People whisper about miracles, divine intervention, prophecies fulfilled. But the stories get complicated when you realize there are two figures born around the same time whose destinies seem intertwined, one in the wilderness, preaching repentance, dunking people in rivers, the other traveling through towns, healing the sick, and challenging the religious establishment. You know their names, John and Jesus. But how often do people stop to think about how different their origins and purposes really were, and why that mattered so much to those in power? John's birth wasn't shrouded in scandal. His parents were old, sure, but respected. His father, Zechariah, was a priest, part of the system. His birth was seen as a reward, a blessing from God to a righteous family. No controversy. No questions. Just a straightforward narrative that aligned perfectly with the religious leaders' comfort zones. John becomes the voice in the desert, calling people to repentance. Harsh, yes, but familiar. His message was rooted in tradition: cleanse yourself, follow the law better, prepare for the Messiah. Safe. Predictable. Then there's Jesus. His mother? A young, unmarried woman. His father? According to official stories, non-existent. From day one, his existence challenged norms. Religious leaders didn't know what to do with someone who defied every expectation of a holy figure. Born outside the system, raised without the pedigree that gave others credibility, yet he spoke with authority that unsettled everyone with power. People couldn't ignore him, but they couldn't easily categorize him either. He wasn't just a teacher or a healer, he was something else. Something dangerous. What really set things off wasn't just what Jesus said, it was how it contrasted with John. John demanded repentance through strict adherence to old laws. Jesus? He talked about overturning the entire system. He called out hypocrisy, dined with outcasts, and openly defied rules that had gone unquestioned for generations. To the common people, that was liberating. To the authorities? Threatening. They could handle John's message. Repentance didn't threaten Rome or the temple hierarchy. But challenging the foundation of those institutions? That was crossing a line. It's no coincidence that John was tolerated longer. His criticisms were sharp, but they targeted individuals, Herod's immoral actions, corrupt tax collectors. Personal flaws. Fixable by returning to the law. Jesus, though? He called the entire structure corrupt, beyond repair. He didn't say, do better within the system. He said, this whole system is the problem. That distinction wasn't lost on the people in charge. John's imprisonment was a political move to shut him up temporarily. Jesus was seen as an existential threat. That's why, when push came to shove, John was beheaded quietly while Jesus' execution was a public spectacle, meant to send a message. The contrast between their births mirrored their deaths. John emerged from an acceptable lineage, challenging people to improve under existing frameworks. Jesus' entire life screamed defiance of the status quo, from his questionable parentage to his refusal to back down when confronted by priests, governors, and mobs. This wasn't just a clash of personalities or missions. It was a collision between two fundamentally different visions of how to approach corruption and injustice. And here's the kicker, people back then were forced to choose. Follow the voice telling you to work within the system or the one urging you to break free from it. Many hedged their bets, supporting John until Jesus came along, then flipping sides when it became clear which movement had the momentum. But those in power saw the writing on the wall early. John could be silenced. Jesus couldn't be ignored. What's wild is how, over time, the narratives got smoothed out, merged, and sanitized. The tension between their missions was downplayed to make the stories more palatable. But in the raw reality of those years, it wasn't neat. It was messy, dangerous, and filled with political intrigue. Births that symbolized different origins, one legitimate, one scandalous, set the stage for lives that would redefine what it meant to challenge authority. Standing in that crowd back then, watching events unfold, you'd have felt the tension in the air. The safe choice or the risky one? Reform or revolution? It wasn't just about religion, it was about survival, loyalty, and what kind of world you wanted to live in. And as history shows, those decisions didn't just affect the people making them. They echoed through centuries, reshaping entire civilizations. Step into the 2nd century, a time when early Christianity wasn't one unified movement, but a battlefield of competing beliefs, doctrines, and factions vying for legitimacy. There wasn't one Christian church, there were many groups, each claiming to hold the true interpretation of Christ's teachings. And these weren't minor disagreements over details. These were all-out ideological wars. On one side, you had the emerging orthodoxy, the group that would eventually become the institutional church, aligned with Roman authority and hungry for structure and power. On the other, a spectrum of rival sects, Gnostics, Valentinians, Simonians, each with their own cosmologies and interpretations that clashed with what the orthodox leaders were trying to establish. This wasn't just about theology. It was about control. Imagine being caught in that chaos. Walk through a bustling marketplace in Alexandria or Rome and you'd hear street preachers shouting conflicting messages. One claims salvation comes through faith alone, another insists secret knowledge is the key. Someone else talks about divine sparks trapped in flesh, urging listeners to reject the material world entirely. Confused? That was the point. Competing truths created confusion, and confusion breeds power for those who can cut through the noise with certainty, even if that certainty was manufactured. The Valentinian sect was especially dangerous to the Orthodox movement. Why? Because they didn't outright reject Jesus, they reinterpreted him. They spoke of a cosmic Christ, separate from the man known as Jesus, and preached that true salvation wasn't about sin and forgiveness, but about awakening to a hidden spiritual reality. This message appealed to the intellectual elite, those disillusioned with simplistic rules and hungry for something deeper. The Valentinians weren't fringe crazies, they were well-educated, persuasive, and infiltrating Christian communities from within. That terrified the bishops trying to consolidate power. You can't build an empire when people are out there telling your followers that the material world, including the institution you're building, is a flawed illusion. Then you had the Simonians, followers of Simon Magus, a figure so controversial he was painted as the ultimate heretic. To the Orthodox, he was a cautionary tale, someone who tried to buy spiritual power and claim divine status. But Simon's followers didn't see arrogance. They saw someone challenging corrupt systems that monopolized religious authority. His movement blended mysticism, magic, and a rejection of legalistic morality. Dangerous ideas when you're trying to create a unified doctrine that demands obedience. The battles weren't just fought in words. Texts were burned. Leaders were excommunicated or worse. The church councils didn't sit around calmly debating. They issued edicts that condemned entire sects to obscurity. Manuscripts deemed heretical were hunted down, erased from official records. But why go to such lengths if these groups were just harmless outliers? Because they weren't. They exposed uncomfortable truths about how flexible early Christian beliefs really were. The church wanted a single narrative. Multiple narratives meant fragmentation, and fragmentation meant weakness in the face of Rome's expectations for religious conformity. And let's not forget how politics played into it. Rome didn't care about theological nuance. It cared about stability. A fractured religious movement was a liability. That's why, as Christianity grew, the factions that aligned with Roman authority got the upper hand. Councils like Nicaea weren't about spiritual enlightenment, they were about eliminating dissent. Doctrines weren't divinely downloaded, they were negotiated, fought over, often decided by which group could wield the most influence and silence opposition. Orthodoxy wasn't born from truth, it was born from survival and strategy. Imagine being a Valentinian or a Simonian during this purge. Your texts are being confiscated, your teachers hunted. You gather in secret, sharing what knowledge you can before the authorities catch wind. It's not just your beliefs on the line, it's your life. And when you're caught, public denunciations, forced recantations, or execution. The message was clear: fall in line or be erased. And over time, that worked. The winning faction wrote the histories, branded the losers as heretics, and buried their contributions. Not because those ideas lacked merit, but because they threatened the consolidation of power. Looking back at the chaos, the power plays, the shifting alliances, and the relentless pursuit of control that shaped what billions believe today. Throughout the journey, we've peeled back layers of edited texts, manipulated narratives, and outright erasures. But underneath all of that, one theme keeps surfacing: the struggle for knowledge. Not just facts or teachings passed down from authority, but real understanding. The kind that challenges comfortable beliefs and threatens those who benefit from ignorance. You have to consider how many voices were silenced to preserve a single, dominant version of spiritual truth. Entire communities, with their own interpretations, questions, and insights, were wiped from memory. Their texts burned, their names blackened, their legacies buried under centuries of institutional control. And yet, despite the relentless efforts to crush dissent, fragments survived. Scraps of forbidden writings, oral traditions whispered through generations, archaeological finds that refuse to stay hidden. They reveal a world where spiritual exploration was vast, diverse, and often dangerous. A world where people weren't afraid to ask hard questions, even when the answers threatened to upend everything they thought they knew. Knowledge was never just about information, it was about freedom. The power to think for yourself, to challenge authority, to refuse the convenient lies packaged as eternal truths. That's why those in power fought so hard to keep it locked away. If people understood the real complexities behind their beliefs, the whole structure holding that power in place could crumble. And let's not pretend it was only about religion. Political leaders, empires, and wealthy elites all had a stake in keeping people docile and unquestioning. Control the narrative, and you control the masses. Now, think about the individuals who defied that system. They weren't gods or legends, they were people. People who risked their lives, their reputations, everything, to seek out truths others wanted buried. Some were branded heretics, others traitors, but their defiance carved cracks in the walls built to contain knowledge. And through those cracks, light still manages to shine. The survival of alternative texts wasn't luck, it was the result of relentless efforts by those who believed that no one should dictate what truths people are allowed to explore. History isn't just something that happened. It's something that's constantly being rewritten, edited, and, if you're not paying attention, manipulated. Every empire falls, every institution shifts, but the fight for understanding remains. And you? You're part of that story. Every time you question a narrative, dig deeper than the surface, or refuse to accept something just because it's what you've always been told, you're continuing a legacy of rebellion against ignorance. That's the uncomfortable truth that many would rather you forget. This entire exploration has been about looking at the untold sides of a story you thought you knew. The Serpent wasn't just a villain. The heroes weren't always pure. And those labeled heretics might have been the ones holding the keys to understanding all along. History isn't clean. It's messy, political, and shaped by those with agendas. But buried under all that mess are truths waiting to be uncovered by those willing to dig deep enough. To everyone who stuck with me through this journey, a thank you. Truly. In a world full of distractions and surface-level content, choosing to engage with something that challenges you, that pushes you to think differently, means more than you know. I appreciate you giving me your time, your attention, and your open mind. Stay curious. Stay questioning. There's always more beneath the surface, and I'm glad you took the plunge with me. See you in the next one.